First Minister's questions. Question number 1 from Jackson Carlaw.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. After months, years even, of sanctimony from the First Minister and her Brexit Secretary,
Jackson,
yesterday
Mr. Carlaw, I'm just going to suspend. I'm going to suspend proceedings for a few moments. Proceedings are suspended. Thank you very much, colleagues. We'll resume business and we'll start again with question number 1 from Jackson Carlaw.
And if we're not to be a fortress, Presiding Officer, we have to be prepared to accept that demonstrations are a democratic right. We have to be prepared for that. But I've given it away. After months, years even, of sanctimony from the First Minister and her Brexit Secretary, yesterday SNP MPs refused to back the very policy option they have been demanding. Isn't it the case that what Scotland saw yet again yesterday is that when push comes to shove for the SNP, it's not about finding a solution to Brexit, it's about pursuing their independence obsession?
First Minister.
Sorry, Presiding Officer, it's hard not to laugh. The Tory Secretary of State for Scotland abstained on every single option in the House of Commons last night. But as Jackson Carlaw rightly says, and indeed belatedly recognises, for 2 long years, when stopping Brexit didn't seem possible, the SNP argued for single market customs union membership compromise. That was ignored by the Tories and indeed by everybody else. Now, that option, which I think is the minimum you would need to protect Scotland's interests, wasn't actually on the ballot paper last night. That said, over the next few days, we will continue to work across Parliament for a compromise of that nature, if that proves to be the only alternative to a hard Brexit. But let me also say this, Presiding Officer, this whole process, thanks to the Tories, is now such a mess that stopping Brexit altogether must be our top priority. And moreover, that is now possible. Actually, the highest number of votes cast in the House of Commons last night was for the People's Vote option. So, you know, the principles that's guided everything we've done in this is the protection of Scotland's interests. I wonder if Jackson Carlaw can tell us what principles have guided the Scottish Tories, because it seems to me the only principle they've been abiding by is doing whatever their London bosses have told them to do.
Succinctly, please.
There was no principle in the way the SNP voted last night. And what I saw in contrast was a Prime Minister prepared to set aside her own premiership to secure a deal. A deal which, contrary to everything the SNP says, will be good for Scotland and will be good for the UK. And by contrast, here's the First Minister's record. She angrily demands that the Prime Minister go. She angrily commands when the Prime Minister does go. She angrily then declares that the Prime Minister's decision to go, you guessed it, makes the case for independence. Faux outrage, grievance, her own one single-minded obsession. Aren't Scots right to detect just a little bit of a pattern here, First Minister?
More succinctly, please, First Minister.
Well, again, you have to laugh that Jackson Carlaw is coming here today and raising the position of the Prime Minister. You know, it is traditional in politics. It's traditional for leaders to say to colleagues, you know, if you don't back me on an issue of such importance, I might have to resign. Not in the Tories, though. Theresa May's position is, if you don't back me, I'll stay. You know, Theresa May must be the only leader in living memory who has tried to fall on her own sword and has managed to miss. It is utterly ridiculous. Now, the SNP, in contrast to the Tories, will continue to stand up for Scotland's interests. That's what we have done since day one after the Brexit referendum. And the way to stand up, not just for Scotland's interests, but the way to stand up for the interests of the entire UK right now is to recognise that this Brexit process is a complete and utter mess and put this issue back to the people. So belatedly, can Jackson Carlaw find it within himself to actually stand up for Scotland instead of being the last man standing up for Theresa May?
Jackson Carlaw.
Presiding officer, Nicola Sturgeon doesn't stand up for the Scottish interest, she stands up for the nationalist interest. On Monday, the Prime Minister said she was sceptical that yesterday's trawl through the alternatives would produce an outcome. She was right. For the avoidance of doubt, no deal was rejected. A second referendum was rejected again. Revoking Article 50 was rejected. Yesterday, when it came to the crunch, the First Minister whipped her MPs against supporting her own policy of a customs union and single market membership, and that was defeated, too. Doesn't the result of these votes demonstrate that Alex Neil and Jim Sillars are right? The best way forward to secure an orderly withdrawal is to support the Prime Minister's deal.
First Minister, more succinctly, please.
Well, as I say, the compromise position that the SNP put forward when it looked as if Remain wasn't an option, which is not the case now, incidentally, wasn't on the ballot paper last night. It has never been our position to accept just a customs union. That would not be sufficient to protect Scotland's interests. But I disagree with Jackson Carlaw in his characterisation of what happened last night, because if you look at two of the options, yes, a customs union alone, but also a second referendum, both of those options got more votes in the House of Commons last night than the Prime Minister's deal has managed on either of the occasions it's been brought forward and defeated. So actually I think that does give the House of Commons something to move forward with into next week. And no, I don't think the thing to do now is to vote for a bad deal that would take Scotland out of the EU, out of the single market and out of the customs union. The right thing to do now is to put this issue back to the people. And I'll say again, if Jackson Carlaw was interested in actually standing up for Scotland, or indeed the interests of the UK, that's the option he would be arguing for too.
Jackson Carlaw.
The argument for many against the Prime Minister's deal is that there was support for an alternative. The votes in the House of Commons last night demonstrated that there is not. It's clear that there is a deal, one which secures an orderly way forward. One supported by Jean-Claude Juncker, supported by Donald Tusk, supported by 27 of our other EU partners, backed by the business community here in Scotland, by the whisky industry, by our fishermen. That's the Prime Minister's deal. Surely after all the confusion, with every other alternative being rejected yesterday, the national interest is served by supporting that compromise. Surely it's time to back the deal and get on with it.
First Minister.
You know, the Prime Minister's deal may be or may not be backed by all of the people that Jackson Carlaw has just listed there. The problem is the Prime Minister's deal is not backed by his own party. And that's why she cannot get it through. Even if every single SNP MP was to have backed the Prime Minister's deal, it would still have gone down to massive defeat. It is time that the Prime Minister and her sole remaining defender, Jackson Carlaw, or sole remaining defenders, the Scottish Tories, accepted that that deal is dead, and it is now time to move on to another option. The option that got most votes last night in the House of Commons was the people's vote. That's the right thing to do, and again what we see today is Jackson Carlaw failing to stand up for Scotland's interests and simply standing up for Theresa May and his London bosses.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding officer, the Prime Minister's answer to Commons gridlock and Brexit meltdown is to offer to resign again. But while MPs can't make a decision, too many people in the real world have no choice but day in and day out to make heartbreaking decisions as a result of a decade of Tory austerity. Decisions like paying the bills or feeding their children. And the result, over 500,000 food parcels were handed out in Scotland over the past 18 months. So, does the First Minister agree with me that Brexit isn't the only reason why Theresa May must go?
First Minister.
Yes, I do. And I look back a few years to 2014 and I reflect on the fact that if Labour hadn't teamed up with the Tories to stop Scotland becoming independent, we wouldn't have had a Tory Prime Minister for these last few years.
Richard Leonard. All right. Order, please. Richard Leonard.
Well, the First Minister was teaming up with some interesting people at the weekend, I noticed. And I know.
Order, please. Order, please. Thank you.
That's constitutional politics. So,
let's keep the noise down, please. Order, please. Richard Leonard.
The First Minister and I may differ on some things, but we share some frustrations about the Brexit process, not least in how it is detracting from all of those other issues that really matter to people. Issues like jobs, like schools and hospitals, issues like child poverty. In October last year, the First Minister told me that she would not support Labour's plan to increase child benefit by £5 a week because her government estimated that it would lift only 20,000 children out of poverty. New figures for child poverty were published by the Scottish Government this morning. So can the First Minister tell the Chamber how many more children in Scotland are now living in poverty?
First Minister.
Child poverty, if we look at the figures this morning, has increased, and I think that is deeply regrettable. We know why it's increasing, because of the welfare cuts and the austerity being imposed by Tory governments. Child poverty and poverty generally in Scotland is too high, although it's important to note that it's lower in Scotland than it is in either England or indeed Labour-run Wales. But nevertheless, it is because child poverty is too high that we are firstly taking steps to mitigate the impact of Tory welfare cuts. It's why we are taking steps to invest in reducing child poverty. And of course, it's why we are committed to the introduction of an income supplement, but one that lifts more children out of poverty by making sure we target that resource to those who most need it. And when we publish the way forward on that by June this year, I hope we'll get Scottish Labour's support for it.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, this morning's figures show that 10,000 more children in Scotland are living in poverty. That means almost 250,000 children in Scotland are living in poverty today. No wonder Dr Mary MacLeod from the anti-poverty project A Menu for Change says that the Scottish Government must, and I quote her, give people living on cups of tea and thin air more to sustain them, and they must do it now. Or that the Child Poverty Action Group says that, and I quote them, the Scottish Government's timetable for a new income supplement fails to reflect the extraordinary increase in child poverty that the country faces. Children in poverty really can't wait until 2022. So, First Minister, can you tell us, why are you making these children wait?
First Minister.
Because we are doing the work to make sure that we have a policy that can be delivered, a policy that can be paid for, and a policy that lifts the maximum number of children out of poverty. Now, this is a week in which Labour's most recent policy announcement on bus travel has been exposed as completely unworked through. It is not fair to promise people things that you cannot deliver. And we will not do that. We will take forward plans that can be delivered. In terms of our action now to tackle poverty, we are investing £125 million a year to mitigate the worst impacts of Tory policy. We heard what the UN Rapporteur on Poverty had to say when he said that the Scottish Government, devolved administrations in general, are mitigating the worst impacts of austerity, despite experiencing significant reductions in block grant funding and limits on their ability to raise revenue. But mitigation comes at a price and is not sustainable. So what we will continue to do is take real action. And what we will also continue to do is demand that the powers that the Tories are now using to impose these policies in Scotland are actually brought to this Parliament. And the sooner Richard Leonard supports us in that, the better.
Gillian Martin, to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This week, the Instant Neighbour charity published some startling figures on a stark increase in people in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire receiving emergency food parcels from food banks, with 12 independent food banks distributing over 27,000 parcels in the last 18 months. Would the First Minister give her assessment on why we're seeing such an increase and what can be done to stop the rise in food bank use in an area where everyone should be thriving?
First Minister.
Well, the latest data showing the number of food banks and number of emergency food parcels does show these numbers as being far too high. The Scottish Government promotes an approach to tackling food insecurity that has dignity at its heart. We support Fair Share, for example, to help build better community resilience. And as I've just said in response to Richard Leonard, we are doing everything we can to mitigate the impact of the welfare cuts and the austerity being imposed in Scotland that are the driving factors behind this increase in food bank use. So in answer to Gillian Martin's question, that is the reason we will, in the Scottish Government, continue to do everything we can to mitigate it, but the sooner we can tackle these issues at source, the better, by taking these decisions here in our own Parliament.
And motion number 3, Alison Johnson.
Thank you. It's clear that the First Minister shares my grave concern that the Scottish Government and Resolution Foundation analysis confirms that the number of children living in poverty in Scotland is steadily rising. And it's clear that she shares my anger and frustration too, that this worrying rise, in the words of the senior economic analyst at the Resolution Foundation, is almost entirely driven by UK-wide decisions. So while we continue to call for an end to the mean-spirited, punitive welfare policies of the UK Government, it's clear that the Scottish Government must do all that it can to raise the living standards of our poorest families. But is the First Minister really saying that low-income families in Scotland will have to wait until 2022 before the Scottish Government introduces a desperately needed income supplement?
First Minister.
Firstly, I agree with Alison Johnson's sentiments. As we have said, we will set out an update on this work by June this year, and that will be available for Parliament as a whole to scrutinise and to debate. That will be published alongside our analysis of policy and delivery options. And these are important aspects. Delivery option, as well as how we pay for this policy, is a vital part of making sure that it can be delivered properly. And also, in terms of what drives some of our work behind this, there's two principles in particular. Firstly, reaching the greatest number of children in poverty and topping up incomes sufficiently to lift those households out of poverty. In terms of the Give Me 5 campaign, which I've got a lot of sympathy for the organisations behind that, what we do see is that £7 out of every £10 of that would be spent on families not living in poverty. If we're going to do this, which we are committed to doing, we must make sure that the money gets to those most in need.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. I thank the First Minister for her response. Living up to the targets that this Parliament unanimously supported in the Child Poverty Act must be a priority. So we have to use every single tool that we have at our disposal. The Resolution Foundation's report on child poverty says, and I'm quoting, "It's possible that replacing the current regressive system of council tax, as cross-party talks are set to discuss, could help reduce child poverty if done right." Will the First Minister commit to ensuring our local and national tax systems are significantly more progressive, allowing us to raise the money we need to fight child poverty in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, of course, we're already raising extra revenue through a more progressive system of income tax, which I think is something the Greens welcome, even if it's not something every party across this chamber welcomes. As Alison Johnson has already referred to, we have committed to cross-party talks on reform of the council tax, and I hope all parties will agree to take part in that, and certainly putting the progressive principle at the heart of that should be a priority and an objective for all of us.
We have some further supplementaries. The first from Maurice Corrie.
The First Minister joined me in welcoming the excellent announcement from the Prime Minister yesterday that our armed forces men and women serving in Scotland on a tour of duty will now receive financial recompense from the UK Government in the tax year 2019-20 as a result of the increase in tax rates imposed by this SNP Government last year.
First Minister.
I was just wondering there which welcome announcement of the Prime Minister he was going to ask me to welcome there. But on this one, it's interesting, isn't it? The Tories talk about those in our armed forces who, because of our progressive system of income tax, those paid more highly pay a little bit more tax in Scotland. What we don't hear the Tories talking about are the estimated 37,000 MOD personnel in England, the lower paid people who are now paying more tax than their counterparts in Scotland do. Now, interestingly, I haven't heard any suggestion that the Tories are going to compensate them for the fact they're paying more tax in England than they would be if they were based here in Scotland. Nor do I hear the Tories saying that they're going to compensate MOD personnel in England for the free prescriptions that their counterparts in Scotland get, or their access to free education if they're ordinarily resident in Scotland that people in England don't get. So MOD personnel, just as every public sector worker in Scotland, gets a far better deal than their counterparts in England, and that's something the Tories should be reflecting long and hard on.
And Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, Theresa May offered up her own resignation as an attempt to win support for her deal, and even that doesn't seem to have been enough. Does the First Minister think it's high time the Prime Minister accepted her deal is finished and Article 50 should be revoked to put a stop to this chaos?
First Minister.
Yes. It seems to me that, apart from Theresa May, the only people who don't see that her deal is completely dead are the Scottish Conservatives. It's time to move on to better options. I've made my view clear on a people's vote. But interestingly, the House of Commons last night had the option to emphatically rule out no deal by saying that in that scenario they would choose to revoke Article 50 instead. Joanna Cherry from the SNP put that amendment down last night. And interestingly, I think perhaps, I'd need to double check this, I think perhaps with one exception, all of the Scottish Tories voted in a way that would suggest that they would prefer no-deal Brexit to actually revoking Article 50. I think that is inexplicable when we see the damage that no deal would do to Scotland, and yet another example of the Tories being way out of sync with Scotland's national interests.
Stevenson.
Has the First Minister noted that the vote of an individual Democratic Unionist is worth over £100 million, but the opinion of this Parliament is worth nothing, and similarly the Cardiff Parliament? How does the First Minister respond to that?
First Minister.
I don't think it will be lost on many people across Scotland that a handful of DUP MPs right now appear to have more say over Scotland's future than the democratically elected Parliament of Scotland does. And that is absolutely disgraceful. But I don't think it should be lost on the Scottish Tories. The DUP appear to be able to get all of this money out of the Prime Minister. There's more Scottish Tories than there are DUP MPs, so why are they not managing to get anything for Scotland? Because the Scottish Tories never managed to do anything for Scotland, ever.
And question number 4, Emma Harper.
To ask the First Minister what progress has been made with the implementation of Frank's Law.
First Minister.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to confirm that the extension of free personal care to those under 65 assessed as requiring it will begin on Monday, with £30 million of new investment being delivered in our budget for 2019-20. We've been working with Carlaw, local authorities and stakeholders to ensure that this will be successfully implemented.
Emma Harper.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer, and can I welcome the expansion and step change in the provision in personal care with the benefit not only to those in the south of Scotland who require care but people across all of Scotland. When free personal care was first introduced in the UK, the UK government clawed back monies that were being spent on attendance allowance. With the extension of free personal care, has the UK government given any commitment not to consequentially cut the disability benefits for people who do receive free personal care?
First Minister.
No, there's been no such commitment from the UK Government, unfortunately. When we were bringing forward the necessary steps to put the extension in place, we did call on the UK Government not to cut these disability benefits, but unfortunately they rejected those calls. Our actions in extension will ensure that no one is left out of pocket by the UK Government withdrawing the care elements of DLA or PIP. But the Tories, I think, really do need to explain why, having rightly backed calls to extend free personal care, that they not only voted against it in our budget in this Parliament, but they're also going to cut DLA or PIP payments from Westminster, because, again, that's something else that seems to me utterly inexplicable.
And Miles Briggs.
Thank you, President Officer. 2 years ago, I was honoured to bring forward Frank's Law Bill to Parliament alongside Amanda Capel. And it's therefore welcome that we are seeing these progress made today. One key area which Alzheimer's Scotland has highlighted in their recent report, which the government haven't responded to, is around equality of access to healthcare for people with advanced dementia. Can I ask the Scottish Government and the First Minister, now that this will be asked by councils to deliver, what steps will ministers take to guarantee that we don't see a postcode lottery develop across Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, we will continue to work with councils, and of course we will continue to liaise with organisations like Alzheimer's Scotland to make sure that people who are assessed as needing personal care get that, and I hope all members will play their part in that. Can I just take the opportunity, though, to commend all those who have campaigned for this policy, in particular Amanda Capel, who I think is due a great amount of credit and gratitude from all of us for all of her efforts. No doubt we'll continue to debate issues like this and issues such as the one that was raised by Emma Harper, but let's for a moment, perhaps on a note of consensus, just pause to reflect on the fact that the introduction of free personal care for the over 65s was one of the proudest achievements of this Parliament in its early years. And I think as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of this Parliament, it is really appropriate and something that all of us across the Parliament should be proud of, that we're extending this policy now to the under 65s as well. And as Parliaments elsewhere on these islands, or a Parliament elsewhere in these islands, obsesses with Brexit, all of us should be proud that our Parliament is getting on with the socially progressive change that our country wants to see.
And question number 6, Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government will consider bringing forward the introduction of an income supplement in light of 2 recent reports predicting an increase in child poverty.
First Minister.
Yes, we will. These reports, as we've reflected on previously today, show us the devastating impact of the UK Government's welfare cuts. They've taken the avoidable and conscious decisions to drive families in Scotland and across the UK into poverty. We have committed to setting out options for the income supplement prior to the summer recess, and we will do so. And we look forward to working with members across the chamber to design and implement an income supplement that can help the maximum number of children and families who need it most.
Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm glad the First Minister agrees these are shocking reports, and we do need to push for urgency because up to date, under the SNP's watch and fuelled by Tory austerity, child poverty in Scotland continues to rise, and the resolution report predicts a rise of up to 29% by 2023. And, Presiding Officer, that should be a cause of shame for every elected member in the chamber. So if I heard correctly, and I do hope I did, I think that the First Minister has finally listened to Labour's call for the income supplement to be brought forward. We can't wait until 2022 at the earliest because, as Dr Mary-Anne MacLeod says, promises to help people in 3 years' time are of little comfort to parents whose cupboards are empty right now. But given that tackling poverty just can't wait, will the First Minister also listen to Scottish Labour, children's charities, faith groups and academics and immediately implement a £5 supplement to child benefit, which would lift tens of thousands of children out of poverty right now? Or will she continue to just talk about it and take action whilst families are struggling below the breadline? You know, jam tomorrow's no use when families don't even have bread today.
Thank you. First Minister.
Well, Presiding Officer, this is a serious issue. I'm on record, not just today, but on many occasions, as saying I think poverty rates generally and child poverty rates in particular in Scotland are too high. In Scotland, the child poverty rate is 22%, far too high. But it is worth noting that in the UK as a whole, it's 26%, and in Wales, it's 26% as well. So the member's assertion that this is somehow down to the SNP simply doesn't bear scrutiny. What does mark the SNP government out, I have to say, is our determination to take action to tackle child poverty. The only part of the UK now with statutory targets, the mitigation we're doing to protect against Tory welfare cuts, and the work we are doing to look at how we have an income supplement that raises the maximum number of children out of poverty. Now, the reality is, whether Labour members want to accept this or not, the reality is we need a delivery mechanism in place for that. We need to have the budgeting to make sure we can do that. We cannot simply promise something that we don't know how it can be delivered or how it can be paid for. So we are doing the hard work now to make it possible, not just in rhetoric, but in reality. And we'll bring forward the update before June of this year, and Parliament as a whole can then debate the best way forward. I think that's the right way to go, and I think that is the way, actually, that is in the best interest, longer term, of children across Scotland.
And Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I actually agree with the First Minister that we should ensure that any money that's given should be targeted to those in need and not given as a universal benefit to many people who don't need it. But can I ask the First Minister, the introduction of an income supplement would experience the sort of economic shock factors, the volatility of the economy. So can I ask, does the First Minister believe that this is a factor that very much needs to be considered in the introduction of an income supplement, and how would the Scottish Government manage that?
First Minister.
I'm not, forgive me, I'm genuinely not sure I entirely understand that question, but I'm happy to reflect on it and reply later on. Of course, when we bring forward the update with suggested ways forward in June, all of these issues can be properly discussed and debated. But I would say to Michelle Ballantyne, you know, in all sincerity, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now if it wasn't for the policies of her party at Westminster, imposing welfare cuts and austerity on children and families across Scotland. And perhaps if she wanted to reflect on that before she next stands up in this chamber to talk about child poverty, we'd all be a lot better off.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the First Minister's questions. We're going to move